The year is 1768. You are adrift in the middle of the unforgiving Atlantic Ocean, a fragile wooden island, completely isolated from civilization. The equatorial sun beats down, relentlessly baking the timber deck. Below the waterline, the hull is a dark, stifling sauna. Temperatures soar, and the humid air is thick with sweat and tar. In this brutal, sweltering environment, fresh meat should putrefy and rot within mere hours. It should become a breeding ground for maggots and lethal disease. Yet, deep inside the darkest corners of the ship's hold, stacked in rows of heavy iron-bound oak casks, sits beef and pork that was slaughtered over 2 years ago. Despite crossing the equator twice, it is perfectly safe for a human to consume. This was not a stroke of maritime luck. This was a highly sophisticated, cold-blooded science. Centuries before the invention of the electric compressor, the Royal Navy had conquered the biology of decay. They created artificial, microscopic deserts. Welcome to Heritage Core. Today, we dissect the 18th century preservation hacks that built an empire, and reveal how you can use them to survive a modern grid collapse. To understand the genius of these methods, we must face the enemy, the invisible army of aerobic bacteria. Bacteria are incredibly resilient, but they have one fatal weakness. They are entirely dependent on moisture. Inside the cellular structure of a freshly butchered cow, there is an abundance of water, blood, and rich proteins. To a microbe, this is an all-you-can-eat buffet. They will multiply exponentially, excreting toxic waste. This waste is what we smell when meat goes rancid. The modern solution is to freeze the water, paralyzing the bacteria. But the 18th century solution was much more violent. They used the brutal physics of osmosis. Enter the first hack, the dry salt cure. Salt is a heavily hydrophilic mineral. It craves water. When meat is completely buried in coarse, dry sea salt, it creates an extreme hypertonic environment. Nature despises an imbalance. The water inside the meat is forcefully drawn out through the cell walls, rushing to dilute the heavy concentration of salt on the outside. But the salt doesn't just suck the moisture from the meat. It violently rips the water straight out of the bacteria's bodies. Their microscopic cell membranes collapse entirely. They shrivel, they suffocate, and they die. The Royal Navy perfected this to an industrial scale. They called the resulting product salt junk, named after the tough, fibrous ropes used on the ships, because that's exactly what the meat felt like. Rock hard. The process began at the naval victualling yards in London. The meat had to be bled completely dry. Any trapped blood would become a vector for immediate rot. Then, butchers cut the flesh into standard 4 to 8 pound blocks. If the blocks were too thick, the salt couldn't reach the center. The core would silently putrefy, turning into a deadly poison. Next came the aggressive rubbing. Men would massage a mixture of salt, saltpeter, and brown sugar into the flesh. The saltpeter preserved the red color, while the sugar kept the meat from turning into literal stone. Finally, the blocks were hammered into heavy oak casks, packed so tightly with pure salt crystals that no air could exist. When a sailor wanted to eat it months later, he had to tow the meat behind the ship on a rope, letting the ocean waves wash the excess salt away for a full day. But for the officers, and those surviving on land, there was a far more elegant and delicious survival trick. The second method, potted meat. If salting was about removing water, potting was about creating an impenetrable fortress against oxygen. This was the Victorian precursor to modern vacuum sealing. The process was surprisingly simple, yet scientifically flawless. First, the meat, often beef, duck, or pork, was heavily spiced. Mace, nutmeg, cloves, and black pepper weren't just for flavor. These spices contain highly potent antimicrobial properties. The meat was slow cooked in its own juices until it fell apart. It was then shredded and packed furiously into a glazed ceramic crock. Every single air pocket had to be crushed out. Then came the absolute stroke of genius: the seal. They would take kidney fat, known as suet, and melt it down slowly. This liquid gold, known as tallow or sometimes clarified butter, was poured thickly over the top of the packed meat. As the molten fat cooled in the cellar, it solidified into a dense, white, airtight wax. It acted as a biological vault door. Without oxygen, the bacteria responsible for rotting simply could not breathe. The meat was trapped in a state of suspended animation. You could leave that ceramic pot in a cool larder for over a year. When winter arrived, you simply broke the fat seal with a spoon, and the meat beneath was as tender and rich as the day it was cooked. But do not be fooled by the simplicity. These historical methods were completely unforgiving. If you attempt this today, you must avoid 3 fatal mistakes. Mistake number 1. The silent assassin. While potting meat kills aerobic bacteria that need oxygen, it creates the perfect playground for anaerobic bacteria. The most terrifying of these is Clostridium botulinum, the bacteria that causes botulism. It thrives in oxygen-free, low-acid, room-temperature environments. It is odorless. It is tasteless. And it is entirely lethal. To prevent it, the meat and the fat must be boiled vigorously, driving out all spores before the seal is poured. Mistake number 2. The fat gap. If you pour the tallow too thinly, or if it cools too rapidly, microscopic hairline fractures will form in the wax layer. Even a single pinhole breach compromises the entire jar. Oxygen rushes in, acting as a green light for mold and rot. The fat cap must be thick, flawless, and completely bonded to the ceramic rim. Mistake number 3. The impure cure. In the 18th century, cheap rock salt was often contaminated with soil. If dirt gets into the curing barrel, the salt's osmotic power is compromised. The moisture isn't extracted properly, and the meat putrefies from the bone outwards. Only the purest, large-grain marine salt guarantees a true biological dead zone. Fast forward to the modern era. We are living in an illusion of permanent abundance. We call it the cold chain, an unbroken line of electricity, keeping our civilization fed. From refrigerated abattoirs, to freezing cargo ships, to the chilled aisles of your local supermarket. And finally, into the glowing white box in your kitchen. But this system is incredibly fragile. It requires a constant, uninterrupted flow of megawatts to survive. If a severe winter storm, a solar flare, or a cyber attack drops the grid, the cold chain shatters instantly. Your expensive, modern refrigerator becomes nothing more than an insulated coffin. Within 48 hours, the temperature inside will breach the danger zone. The bacteria awaken from their frozen slumber. Hundreds of pounds of expensive meat, dairy, and produce will turn into a toxic, festering hazard right inside your home. The supermarkets will be stripped bare in hours. Panic sets in when the reality of starvation becomes visible. But it doesn't have to be this way. True preparedness isn't about hoarding expensive, freeze-dried camping meals. It's about possessing the knowledge to manipulate nature. If the grid goes down, you don't watch your freezer rot. You immediately thaw the meat, boil it down, and render the fat. You grab the coarse sea salt from your pantry. You pack it in glass mason jars or heavy stoneware. You build your own biological dead zones. By looking backward to the 18th century, we find the ultimate blueprint for modern resilience. The Royal Navy didn't conquer the oceans through brute force alone. They conquered it by outsmarting decay itself. Salt, fat, and a little bit of disciplined science. These are the tools of true survival. They are cheap, they are reliable, and they never need a battery change. So, the next time you hear your refrigerator humming softly in the night, do not mistake that sound for absolute security. It is merely a temporary luxury, and when the hum eventually stops, you will know exactly what to do. We are slowly forgetting the skills that kept our ancestors alive. It is our duty to reclaim them. Now, I turn the question over to you. If a total power failure hit your city tomorrow morning, what is the very first item in your kitchen that would go to waste? And more importantly, do you have the knowledge to save it? Would you try dry curing, or would you attempt the potting method? Share your strategies and thoughts in the comments below. This channel is dedicated to unearthing the lost arts of survival. We explore the gritty history of human endurance to arm you with the skills needed for an uncertain future. If you want to discover more forgotten hacks from the past, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Don't let the convenience of today make you a victim of tomorrow. We are Heritage Core. Stay curious, stay resilient, and always respect the old ways. I will see you in the next chapter. Until then, keep your salt dry and your powder ready. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into maritime survival, click the video on your screen right now. We explore the shocking truth behind Victorian water filters, how they drank from a toxic river and lived to tell the tale. It's another crucial skill for your urban survival toolkit. And if you haven't already, join the Heritage Core community. We drop new historical survival documentaries every week. Click subscribe to ensure you never miss a lesson. Stay prepared.